We are in this storyline series that we've been going through for the last few weeks. If you're a visitor here this morning, we've been doing a series on the Bible, not so much preaching from the Bible, but what is the Bible? What is this incredible text that we have, and what can we learn about it that will help us to learn how we live out what is in that text, and how do we make that work? And so we've looked at a few things over the last few weeks. We looked at the New Testament, we looked at the Old Testament, and we looked at some of the just basic facts that sit around the Bible. What is it? Why do we have it? How did we get it? Those kinds of things. And so today what I want to do is go through some of the themes that we see in through the Scriptures, through holding the Old and the New Testament together. And we're going to have a look, I think, at 4 if we've got time. We'll see how we get on. We may only end up doing 3, but we'll have a look at that. And then what I want to remind you of is that next week is our question and response week. So I have 3 questions so far. So there's room for a couple more. 2 of them will take us a little while to dig into, and one of them hopefully has a fairly straightforward response that will be helpful. But they're all great questions, so it would be good to have a couple more. So today we're going to look at some of these themes, and so I want to put that in context because we've talked about how the Bible is one single narrative. And how we have this one single story, this big story that we talk about here. And I've summarized it this way, that we have creation, the goodness of God's creation. We'll talk some more about that in a bit. The fall, this breaking of relationship between God and humanity, and the impact that has much wider in relationship between humanity and themselves, and the earth, and then God. We realize that God does not just simply give up, but he moves into a place of redemption, first of all through the people of Israel, the calling of Abraham, and then obviously we see the pinnacle of that in Jesus. Then we see the outworking of that through the church. That's where we find ourselves just now. And then ultimately we're going to see God's good redemption as he restores all that was broken. That is how we kind of basically want to understand the story that's being told through the 66 books of the Old and New Testament. And so, while it's in 2 sections, the Old and the New Testament, they are very interrelated, they're held together, and we want to see that today, I think, through the themes that we are going to have a look at. So the first theme we're going to have a little look at here is the theme of God's presence, and how that works out. And so first of all, we see God's presence in the garden. We're told that God is present with Adam and Eve in the garden. He is with them. There is an intimacy with them. Indeed, when the fall happens, one of the first symbols of that is that they hide from God, that actually they remove themselves from his presence. That's the first place we see God's presence. The next place that we particularly see it is the tabernacle. So we've had the people of Israel have been in Egypt. Moses comes along and leads them out in the Exodus. They find themselves in the wilderness. The law is given, and part of the law is the building of the tabernacle. And God is present with his people in the tabernacle there. This becomes a really significant event for them. Fire by night and smoke by day. God leads them, and he is present with his people. And then carries on that once they eventually take the land, they cross the River Jordan, they move into the land of Canaan, essentially then building the city of Jerusalem. And of course, then Solomon gets to build the temple. And this is where God is present with his people. When the temple is built, the cloud of glory comes down on the temple. And so this is where the people of God understood God to be present with them. And so when we then find the separation of the kingdom, and then first of all the Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians come and conquer the southern kingdom and carry them off into exile. One of the problems for the Israelites is they're being removed from the presence of God. God is no longer present with them because they understand that he is present here in the temple. And so the great news is this, a baby. Because we're told that, of course, God comes to be present with his people in the person of Jesus. In fact, in John's gospel, when John is doing his little narrative at the beginning, his prelude to his gospel, we have all these fabulous words about light and overcoming darkness and all of this, but there's one little fabulous bit here. Let me read this for you. All fingers and thumbs here. It says this in John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Or in some other translations, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. In other words, the presence of God has come to dwell among us in the person of Jesus. And so now something different's happening. And that carries on, of course, with when Jesus ascends. We see that at the end of Luke's gospel. When he ascends, he says that he's going to send another. And of course, in Acts, we see the sending of the Holy Spirit. And this is the presence of God in and through his church. And then finally, we get the Garden City. It will not look like this. That's Vancouver, for the avoidance of doubt. I imagine that there might be some elements of this, because it's quite a nice place, but probably not the fullness of it. In the Garden City, in this great hope that we have for this redeemed creation, what we're going to find is heaven comes to earth and dwells in, and the two will be together, and we will dwell in the Garden City. And what is the thing that makes the Garden City significant? It's not about how beautiful it is or how big it is. It's the fact that God is with his people. It is about the presence of God. And so the story begins in a garden with the presence of God, and the story ends in a garden city with the presence of God. And this is one of the key themes through the whole of the scriptures, that we could track it in much more detail than we have here. But those are the kind of key movements that we see. It's one story. It's presented in two separate sections, but it's one story. So, if that's one, what would be another theme that we could have a look at? And so I wanted today to have a look at this, at the idea of covenant. So covenant's not a word that we use every day in Portobello. I can wander around saying, oh, I shall make a covenant with you. I suspect there are some of us that use it more often, but it's not a super common word today. One example that we might use it is in marriage. And we'll come back to explain why that's quite a helpful way. But we use words like contract and stuff like that. But a covenant is not a contract. It is like a contract in that it defines obligations and commitments, similar to a contract. However, it's unlike a contract in that it's ultimately relational and personal. And that's why the language of marriage is really helpful, because it is about obligations and commitments, but it's ultimately relational and personal. It binds two people together for the common purpose, and in marriage, that's for a life together. Covenant was the regular language of the ancient Near East. It was used all the time. They didn't really have the context of contract. Instead, they talked about covenants, and you would see those between nations, between kings, between friends. Jonathan and David, for example, make a covenant in the book of Samuel. And so we recognize that covenant was important then. We understand a little bit about what covenant is just now. And then we have this idea that God chooses to relate to his people via covenant, something they understood. And I think that's an absolutely wonderful situation and explains something more of who this God is. He's not simply a God who just relates to us, but he relates to us in ways that make sense to those who were experiencing them. Why is this unfamiliar to us? Well, it wasn't unfamiliar to the people who were entering into these covenants with God. They understood what was happening. One last little sideline. You'll often see it referred to as cutting a covenant. I don't know if anybody's ever come across that phrase. And the reason is because the way that a covenant would often be sealed is that you would take an animal, you cut it in half, you split it in two, and then the two of you would walk through the middle, and the blood, kind of like some weird Damien Hirst thing. But that was a joke for the artists among us, but like one of you got it anyway. And so you would both be covered in the blood, and that's why they called it cutting a covenant, because you would do that. So there are many covenants in the Bible, but there are principally seem to be 5 major ones. Interestingly, the covenant between Adam and God is not usually referred to as a covenant, although it forms some of the same way because it looks at some of the same setup. So the idea of the covenant of caring for creation and stuff like that, I think it's probably best not to include that one. So we're going to begin with Noah. And so each of these covenants kind of moves the narrative forward, or it's another way that we can see how this narrative unfolds. So we've had creation, we've had the fall, and then after the fall, death reigns. It's just an awful, awful situation. 8 times it says, and he died. There was this sense that death has become the defining factor. And so judgment comes to make way for a restored creation. So you'll remember the story, of course, of Noah builds this boat and an ark, and he saves the animals 2 by 2. And then, of course, he sends out, the dove comes back, and it's all good. And we see the rainbow, a symbol of the covenant. And God makes a covenant with Noah. And let me just read to you what that covenant is. Well, you can find it in Genesis chapter 9. Verses 12 to 17. Here we go. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." So God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on earth." So we get this big, broad covenant of God saying, I will never again come in flood to destroy the earth. So then we move on and we get the next covenant, which is really between God and Abraham. And that really is laid out in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. And this, we touched on this a few weeks ago when we were looking at the Old Testament. And it contains 3 elements: the promise of land, the promise of a huge family, and that family would be the bearer of universal blessing to humanity. And that covenant also had an outward sign, and I really struggled to figure out what image I could use for that. So I used a scalpel, because the outward sign of the Abrahamic covenant is, of course, circumcision. And so there's a lot of pictures that would have got me in trouble. That's the one I've gone for. This is a really significant covenant. This is the foundation of the people of God in Israel, and recognizing what the purpose of that was, that the purpose of that was for the universal blessing of the nations. That yes, it involved land. Yes, it involves this incredibly large family that Abraham's going to have, which is the great promise, because they're barren at this point. But it's to be the bearer of universal blessing to humanity. So can we see that covenant has narrowed in a bit from the breadth of the Noahic covenant to the Abrahamic covenant is a bit narrower than it was. But it's still got this huge expansive vision, which is the blessing of all humanity. So next one is the Mosaic covenant. So now we've moved on in the story. We've moved through. Abraham now has a family. They've been in Egypt. Moses has been raised up, and he's called them out of Egypt. And God has led them through the sea, and they are now in the wilderness, and they are now a people. So we have part of that Abrahamic blessing and covenant coming true. Now what we are looking for is, what does it look like to be in the land? What does it look like to be a blessing to humanity? So God comes and brings the law, and this is the covenant that God makes with Moses, who goes to Mount Sinai and is given the law. The law is then to be the thing that if Israel lives in obedience to it, it will bring them blessing, and if they live in disobedience to it, it will bring cursing. We talked a little bit about this, about the realities of living and staying in the land when we were looking at that a few weeks ago. And so Israel are given a sign for this one too, and that is the outward sign of Sabbath, that Israel will reflect their commitment to this covenant by the outward way they live. Exodus chapter 31 and verses 12 to 18. Let me just go here. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." That actually Sabbath becomes a symbol of this Mosaic covenant. Second last one. The Davidic covenant. So Israel are now in the land. So we now have a people and we have a land. But they're now in the land, and the problem is they now want a king because they want to be like all the other nations. That's where we're at in the story. And so they cry out to God, and Samuel eventually, on behalf of God, relents, and they have Saul. And Saul begins all right and then becomes a bit of a disaster, and then they've raised up David. God has called and anointed David. And the promise there becomes that there will be one who would come from David's line, whose throne and dominion will last forever. So do we see again, we've got this narrowing in slightly of the covenant. So this is now very focused on Israel. It's focused on, as they understand it, to be their kingdom, and that this kingdom will be a dominion that will last forever. But it still has in view that that will go beyond, that the blessing of that will go beyond. But we've had this consistent narrowing in all the way from Noah, in the way and in the way. And then finally, we come to the new covenant. We can turn to, in our Bibles, to the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew 26. And these will be very familiar words to us. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And when he'd taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. Do you remember what I said about a covenant being made in blood earlier? But I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Jesus is saying, I am the fulfillment of all of these other covenants, and in me there is a new covenant that is the fulfillment of all of them. The New Testament authors present Jesus as the offspring of Abraham who trusted Yahweh even to the point of death and became a blessing to all nations. He fulfills that Abrahamic covenant. He is greater than Moses. He leads us out of bondage just as Moses did, and we saw that the story tells us that. But he is also the obedient Israelite who perfectly fulfills all the laws that God had given. He is the royal son of David. who inaugurated God's kingdom in his life, death, and resurrection, and who now sits at God's right hand, forever reigning on the throne. Friends, this in Jesus is the fulfillment of all these other covenants. So we have this theme of covenant that runs through, and it gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And actually, at one point, it gets so narrow, the covenant's about one person. But the good news is that his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension to sit on the throne is so that we all in Christ can have access to all the blessings of that. And so Jesus becomes the fulfillment of all these other covenants that will be a blessing to all of humanity. That is why we look at the theme of covenants. We understand that there is a theme that runs through the Old Testament into the New Testament and finds its fulfillment there. We'll do two more. They're a bit shorter, you'd be pleased to hear. We're going to look at the goodness of creation, and then we're going to have a look at the sea, which seems a bit odd. So the goodness of creation. Now, we're Scottish, right? Or at least we're in Scotland. Many of us are Scottish. If you spend enough time in Scotland, you become a de facto Scot. And what that means is that you become a Calvinist. I don't know if you knew this. Basically, it's in the water. That's what happens, right? It's not deliberate, but it just happens. Like the Protestant work ethic, right? You're like, we've all got it because it's just in the water. That's what happens. And one of the things that happens with this is that we go, world's all broken. Everybody's a terrible sinner, and it's all filthy and bad. So I want us to talk about the goodness of creation, because the story doesn't begin with creation or people being bad or wrong or anything like that, right? But we're in Scotland, so we need to moan about something, so we're always convinced that it's about the bad thing, right? Bless John Knox, but one of the consequences is we're all miserable. We're all doomed. But we're not. Because when it began, it was all exceedingly good, like a Mr. Kipling cake. Genesis chapter 1, right back at the beginning. And we're going to look at verse 31. It says this. God saw all that he has made. So this is the end of all the 6 days. It was done. God saw all that he made, and it was very good. Exceedingly good is the way that we could say it. God made creation, and it was exceedingly good. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not always the instinct of how I think about creation. I always end up, the fall keeps coming back in. I keep thinking it's all broken, it's hard work, and it's painful. But what if creation was once really good, exceedingly good? Almost as good as a Mr. Kipling cake. Well, because it means that what we're hoping for is also exceedingly good. Not just a wee bit better than the pain that we experience now. You know, there's a bunch of people in our church who've had death around them recently, in family or in friends or whatever. And that's not exceedingly good. In fact, that's exceedingly bad. And we just begin to assume that that's just the way that things should be. And it's not. It was not made like that. It was made exceedingly good. So what was made exceedingly good? All of creation was made exceedingly good. Anything God made was exceedingly good. This is the end of the creation narrative, right? It's not the middle of it, and then he suddenly made some stuff after that, and you go, well, you made a mistake with that, didn't you? That was a proper Friday job, you know, like half-baked trying to get out of there at 3 o'clock. It's all of creation. Everything God made was exceedingly good. Let's go through a few of those things that I think are helpful to see. So, first of all, humanity is made exceedingly good We are made in the image of God. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. All before the fall. He made them all exceedingly good. Exceedingly good. And that imago Dei, that image of God, is made perfect in Jesus, ultimately. And he restores all the things that have gone wrong. So we could go through and look at this theme of the image of God through the whole of creation. So when we see him talking about idols and stuff that have eyes but don't see, and ears but don't hear, and mouths but don't speak, why does he use that language? Because the perfect image of God is us. And when we are made well, eyes that see and ears that hear and mouths that speak are part of what it means to be our image bearingness. And that raises a lot of questions about, for those of us who can't see properly, I am one of those, who can't hear properly, I wear hearing aids, I am one of them, and you can all attest, I can't speak properly either. So, what do we do with that? That's a sermon for another day. But the truth is that the consequence of the fall is that all of those things have been broken. And if we begin to look at Jesus and how he fulfills all that he is supposed to be, one of the things we see is that he heals the lame. Very importantly, he heals the blind and the deaf and the mute. Why does that matter? Because he's restoring the image of God in people. He's not just fixing the thing that appears to be wrong. We've been told a bigger story, that we're going back to this moment of the goodness of God, that this is our hope. I'll be there all day. We'll move on. Work. I want us to realize this, and this goes back to what Belle was saying earlier about our theme at Canopy yesterday, was taking our everyday, ordinary lives and laying them on the altar before God. Because do you know what? Work was made before creation, right? It is good for us to work, and we are made to work. It is not right that we just sit about and laze and put our feet up and don't do anything. We were made to work. Now, there's a consequence of the fall that means we're told that toiling in the ground will be hard and work becomes hard. But the good news for us is that if when God looked and saw everything was good and work was part of that, it means that when we go to work tomorrow, maybe God has a part of his exceedingly good plan that is part of what you are going to spend your day doing. Whatever that happens to be, it could be spending time with family, it could be in leisure, it could be in work, it could be that you get to be a doctor or a teacher, or you get to be somebody at a checkout and you're the only person that the folk will speak to for the whole day. Maybe you get to create something as a copywriter and you can use good language to communicate important things to people. Maybe you're an artist and you get to create beauty in our world. Part of the exceedingly good is that we get to work. It's not a curse to work. It is actually part of the goodness of God's creation. Then the last one is relationships. We are told that it is good for man for relationships to happen. We know that it is good that when God looks around and says, "Is there a helper suitable for Adam?" And there isn't, and so he makes another one from one. Again, we're about to step on territory that maybe you want to ask about next week, but what happens there? And because suddenly we get male and female, which means that the first one wasn't just male and female, but anyway, we're now going in places I don't want to go today. But the reality is that it's not good for humans to be alone. Loneliness is the single biggest cost to the NHS. Loneliness. Not cancer, not anything else. Loneliness. We know that because when God looked and saw that things were good, by then we had man and woman in relationship. And the man and woman part's not the key part of that. The key part is relationship. It's not just about marriage. This is about, are we in places of relationship where people have real life-giving relationship together? It matters. It was exceedingly good. And friends, if that's true, if it is exceedingly good that relationships are part of that, then as a foretaste of the kingdom, as a little taste of heaven here on earth, as the church, then we need to make relationships in our foreground. It matters that we get on well. It's why we talk about forgiving and being forgiven. It's why we talk about challenging and encouraging one another. It's why it matters that we gather here on a Sunday. It's why our gathering doesn't end when we stop the singing, but it continues as we have tea and coffee together, because that's part of who we are, the way we relate to one another. But we can always do more. You see, those of us who are married, I think, have a particular burden in this space, because it's important that we don't just lock ourselves off as little nuclear families and think we've got it sorted. We ought to be the family of God here. So where is the place for the single person who comes and spends part of their time with your family? Where is the place that we make sure that we invest in all the relationships that exist within our church family? We say that we want to value multi-generational leadership, relationships. How do we make space for those? Where do we make space for those? They matter. Relationships of all kinds are part of God's exceedingly good. We get to lean into that. The Bible tells us that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If God created something good, he's not going to simply scrumple it up and throw it in the bin and say, well, I'll try again. The good news is that there is a renewed creation coming. The book of Revelation is really clear, but we can go back to Isaiah, we can go back to Jeremiah, we can go back to Ezekiel, and we see that God has always said that he will make well what is broken. And we will be the beneficiaries of this renewed creation. Last one, just so that you can see something a little bit more or less heavy. The sea. The sea. Anybody like the sea? I love the sea. It's great, yeah. It's lovely. It's a daft question. You live in Portobello, right? It costs you a fortune to live here, but one of the advantages is you've got the sea here, right? Why does everyone keep wanting to move here? The answer's not the lovely people. The answer is the fact the sea is here. I mean, the place is full of lovely people, of course, but it's about the sea. Except the Bible doesn't have the same view. In fact, in Revelation 21, we're told there will be no more sea. That's very disappointing. Because I find it, in fact, the picture I put up about the Garden City deliberately had sea in it because the sea's nice. Does God really not like the sea? What's going on with that? There must be something else. So, Genesis 1 we're back to, and we have the sea appearing here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. Oh, there's the sea. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. What's going on? What is it that is happening? Well, I think, in fact, I don't think. Often I say I think when I'm just not sure, but I'm 100% convinced of this. That in the Old Testament, the sea is a symbol of chaos and evil. It's always used like that. We could look through a whole bunch of different texts. We looked at Jonah, didn't we, on our church weekend? The sea there, a symbol of chaos and evil, a place that is used as judgment for Jonah. And so he ends up in there. We see in the Psalms, we can see in Psalm 69 that, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I have come into the deep waters, the floods engulf me." We mentioned Noah earlier, of course. The sea is a symbol of a place of chaos and evil. Matthew 5, we see the story of Jesus casting out demons, and he casts them into the pigs. And where do the pigs go? Does anyone remember what happens after he throws them into the pigs? Where do they go? They go over the cliff into the sea. So back where they came from. Matthew 14, Jesus walks on water. Why would that be a big deal? Well, because if the sea symbolizes chaos and evil, then indeed to have someone who can walk on water would seem that they have some control over the properties of the sea. It says something about the person who's walking on the water. In fact, the same story is true when, of course, the disciples get into a boat with Jesus. He's having a wee kip up the back, and they go, "No, wake up, we're going to drown, we're going to drown." Now, you have to remember, these are fishermen, right? They're quite familiar with the sea, and they're freaking out about it. What's going on? And Jesus gets up, and he literally says, "Be quiet, shut up," to the sea, and the sea goes calm. And Mark's gospel records, of course, that at the end of that, they're terrified. Not during it, but after it. Why are they terrified? Because they're good Jewish boys, and they know that the only person who can command the sea to do anything is God. Symbol of chaos and evil. So why is it that then in Revelation there is no more sea? Not because the sea's not beautiful and it doesn't give us all this wonderful stuff that we get. It's because there is no more chaos and no more evil. It doesn't exist anymore. That, friends, is our great hope. That as we look at all these themes, we can see that there's chaos and there's evil and there's brokenness and there's pain and there's sorrow. The great hope, Revelation 21, there is no more sea. For those of the cold water swimmers, don't worry. I'm sure there will be somewhere for you to go cold water swimming. And it will be clean. No more chaos. No more evil. I've gone through 4 themes. We could have done another 7, 8 themes. But the goal of this is to see the kind of things that God has always been at work in. I want us to leave here confident that the Old Testament and the New Testament are not telling 2 different stories. That they're not, as we talked about a few weeks ago, one with a loving God and one with an angry God that are somehow separate, that we have to resolve. But that in actual fact, there is one story that's been played out through that whole story. And it's God at work in the world. And remember that Jesus has calmed the chaos. One day, all the chaos will be gone. In the meantime, we get the privilege of working with Him in our ordinary, everyday lives to see the ways in which His redemptive purposes will be unveiled. We are the church. We are part of God's great plan of redemption for the world. You have purpose in all that we do. All that we do in seeing God restore His good creation once again. Let me pray for us, and then Judith will lead us in song to close. Father, we've covered a load of ground and a lot of material, and some of it will be helpful and others less so, I'm sure. But Lord, would you help us to grab hold of that which is helpful and to think about how we might apply that in our thinking about Scripture, thinking about you, thinking about your purposes and plans in this world and in our calling to be your people in this world. Lord, I pray for us that we would have a new burning passion to read your word, to understand that these are words of life and hope that you have given to us. Father, we love you. We want to love you more. We want to see in our lives and in the lives of those around us more of that exceedingly good creation being restored.